begin, I'm Becky Amato. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at Illinois Humanities. And for those of you who don't know Illinois Humanities very well, we are the State Humanities Council, and we support programming of a variety of many kinds around envisioning justice, we do grant making, we have a program, an education program that I run called the Odyssey Project for income eligible adults in the Chicagoland area who want to study the humanities. We have we have the museum on Main Street, which is a Smithsonian traveling exhibition in the rest of the state of Illinois. So we just do a lot of things that we're really excited about and proud of. And I hope that if you don't know about us, you will get to know us a little bit better tonight. I want to acknowledge the land that we're on right now and make sure that that I do that before we begin. At Illinois Humanities, we respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we are presenting today is made up of the territories and lands of the people of Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations, as well as many other tribes who've called this land home, including the Miami, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee nations. These nations were forcefully removed from their traditional territories, and these lands continue to carry the stories, resilience, and tenacity of these nations. Despite the federal and local government enforced policies of genocide on American Indians, Chicago is home to the third largest urban Indian population, representing more than 100 different tribal nations. And I actually believe we're the second largest urban Indian population east of the Mississippi. We also recognize that land acknowledgement statements are most meaningful when coupled with a commitment to programs and actions that support Indigenous rights and cultural equity. We acknowledge that Illinois Humanities is really just starting this journey. We have a lot more work to do, but we're committed to supporting and building sustained relationships with Indigenous organizations throughout Illinois, and I encourage you to support these organizations and efforts as well. And I just want to add that this program this evening is part of a program called The Big Read, which we are calling Rememory, History, Trauma, and Historical. I actually just forgot what it was called. It's called Rememory, The Big Read. And it's the last few events of this program during which we've been reading in community book groups, books about generational trauma, the legacies of the Atlantic slave trade, and thinking about these through some supernatural lenses. So the final book that we're reading right now, which I will show right here, which is called The Kingdom of This World by Alejo Carpentier, is about the Haitian Revolution, which is one of the reasons we really wanted to collaborate with our great friends at the Haitian American Museum of Chicago and Dr. Joseph, who will be running the workshop tonight, because you know, these are the experts in the Haitian American experience in Chicago. And it ties in really well. And next year, we're hoping to do another big read that will actually be connected to the Indigenous histories of our nation and our region as well. A couple last things. I want to thank my colleagues at Illinois Humanities for supporting this program tonight and all of the programs for the Big Read, particularly Jen Yu, who's been the technical and administrative support and is just basically a wonder in every way. So I'm happy that she's here tonight too. And I want to thank the National Endowment for the Arts and Arts Midwest, who are our funders. We have another program coming up next month, and we'll throw a link in the chat about that during the program. But I don't want to talk much more except to say thank you to both Carlos Bossard and to Dr. Courtney Joseph for being here tonight and being such wonderful partners. So enjoy.
Thank you so much, Becky. Good evening, everyone. My name is Carlos Bossard, and I'm the Executive Director of the Haitian American Museum of Chicago. We are so excited to be a part of tonight's event with Illinois Humanities and the fabulous Dr. Courtney Joseph. Thank you so much for having us, and it's really great to see you all. The museum's mission is to promote and preserve Haitian art, culture, history, and community in Chicago and beyond. We were founded in 2012 by Ms. Elsie Hector Hernandez to help change the narrative about what folks know about Haiti. And we truly are the epicenter for Haitian culture and society in Chicago and throughout the Midwest. We are located in the Uptown neighborhood of Chicago, so if you haven't visited us before, please make sure to stop by and check us out very soon. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce a longtime partner and a very good friend of the museum, Dr. Courtney Joseph. Dr. Courtney Pierre Joseph is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Lake Forest College. She specializes in African American history and culture, Haiti and its diaspora, women and gender studies, and hip hop culture. Dr. Joseph earned her PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2017. She has spoken at numerous institutions and events, including the DuSable Museum of African American History and in the fall of 2020, the Chicago Humanities Festival. She is also working with us at the Haitian American Museum of Chicago to create the first oral history archive dedicated to the Haitian diaspora in Chicago. Dr. Joseph is also currently working on her first book, tentatively titled DuSable's Diaspora, Haiti, Blackness, and Belonging in Chicago. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Courtney Pierre Joseph.
Oh, what a lovely time this is already. Thank you so much to Becky, to Carlos, and to everybody to Jen especially. I know the tech is so important and getting all this together. So I'm very excited to talk about something that I love to talk about, oral histories. And funny enough, this talk lined up in my syllabus this semester as I am teaching my historians workshop class this term, and it's a kind of theory and methods course for students who are interested and are young historians. And one of the things that I do with them is walk them through doing their own oral histories. How do you do this, and how it's such an accessible thing, but a really important methodology that should still be taken seriously. But again, I think it is such an important tool that I'm excited to both, we geeked out on it yesterday in class, and hopefully I'll geek out on all of it with you all this evening. So again, my name is Courtney Joseph, and I'm really excited to talk to you again about oral histories. Take you through a little bit of just a taste of this, which I know people do for a living and is much more expansive than I can give you in the probably, about 45 minutes we have left. But I'll do my best and hopefully pique your interest in the power of what an oral history is and what it can be. So I'll talk a little bit about what it is. I'll talk about my journey with it. The archive with the Haitian American Museum, which has been a lovely and still such an incredibly humbling process. Talk about what it means, some tips or tricks that have worked for me along the ways. And then, a little interactive portion, maybe we'll do an interview, do an oral history, and see how that looks. Hopefully I will leave time for Q&A at the end as well. So what is an oral history? It sounds pretty basic when you hear it, an oral history. Okay, so like hearing about history, which is typically the change over time, the study of the change over time, orally. So yes, in many ways, that's exactly what it is. It's a way to do history, a way to get at, and for historians and other people who are interested in what happened in the past and how it happened in the past and who was there and all of that good stuff, this provides them a tool to get at that information. And it is not just a historical methodology or historical way of doing, this sort of thing. This is also deeply rooted in anthropology, in literature, in language. The importance of language is huge to oral history, right? Like both listening, active listening, which I'm definitely going to talk about, but also speaking and paying attention to what people say, but then how they say it is like super important as well. Language barriers, cultural barriers, all of that comes into play, but also provides lenses into those things. Journalists, definitely use this. There's interviews. I think, Barbara Walter may be really like a queen of oral history. She may not know it, but, on 2020, that's like a perfect example of really still the basis of what is somebody is trying to get out of an oral history. What is your story? And how do you tell it? And why do you tell it in the way that you do? And what does that tell us about larger histories of humanity, of states, of nations, of identities, et cetera, et cetera? It's also deeply rooted in feminist practices, right? This idea, and we have to think about history as a discipline, not just history, right? And I'm doing this and I'm recording this right in a time where we see history being politicized, challenged, discussed, banned, certain histories, right? And if we look at history in the archive over time, the place where typically historians go to do research, that lovely institution, old building that has all these old papers in it and documents that sometimes you wear gloves in them. You can tell I love history. This just makes me excited, right? I'm such a nerd when it comes to historians, but at the same time, I realized early on, those archives don't include me. I'm not in those archives. People who look like me, sound like me, in particular women, people of color, folks from immigrant backgrounds. I come from immigrant parents. We're not in those papers. We're not in those archives. And if we are, the ways that we're referred to is often very violent and damaging. So there's an erasure that happens in the archive that feminist practices over time have helped us to recover those histories and add them to the archive. That is through oral traditions over time and things that people have remembered about silenced folks in the archive. Historians shy away from oral history because they're like, oh, how do you know that what they said is accurate? How do you know? You may never know. It cannot be the full story. But I'm going to just tell you a quick secret. Neither is what's written down on paper. I don't know. That's also not objective. That's also tainted with and chosen and biased and has its own origin. So nothing is objective in the historical archive, and that's a good thing. That's why historians have to have all sorts of materials to do what they do, all sorts of primary sources, including oral histories. So when I decipher an oral history, I'm looking less at what are they saying. That stuff's important. But again, for me, it's the meaning that people make of events in their lives and the events that they experience and that people and society experience. We write these narratives all the time. World War II is a narrative. Civil War is a narrative still. Yes, there are names and dates, but if you become post-structuralists and stuff, then you're like, what is time? And now you're really getting to my students who hate me in the middle of the semester, and they're like, how do you know what is time? So, it's still a history, right? Story is key in there. So how do you unpack that? How do you think about the who, what, where, when, and in particular, the why of people's memories and what they say about certain events in themselves? People forget things all the time. I asked my students yesterday, all right, what were you doing last Tuesday at this time? And they were like, I don't know. One was like, I was at writing something in Texas. I was on spring break. It was our spring break a week ago. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Okay. How many other people were at the roller coaster? Were on the roller coaster with you? She was like, I was like, all right, well, what time exactly was it? Do you know, how long did you stand in line? Okay. Do you remember what you had for lunch after? And she was like, people forget things. That doesn't mean their memory is not fallible. And again, it's about, or not valid, and it's about what we remember and how we remember it, right? So if oftentimes the things that we remember are things that are formative or things that had an impact on us, and this often is tied to things around trauma, but not always. There's joyful agains. Parents remember the birth of their children. Parents remember little things that their kids did that sometimes you as a kid, your parents tell these stories and you're like, that's a random memory. What? You remember me doing the Macarena at a dance when I was 9? I didn't remember that, right? But for some reason, that was part of my mom's memories of my childhood. And that says something, right? That says that, that was something that she felt maybe proud or some joy or, that it was a really light moment. And my family loves music and we love to dance. So maybe seeing that made her think about, like, that's the sort of stuff that as a historian that I think oral histories allow us to get at. And then finally, what did this event feel like? Have you ever heard a song and gone originally back to a moment, smelled something, ate something, saw somebody? These things then capture the emotions too, and that's often tied to what we remember and what we don't. And sometimes that also means that folks will not talk about certain things. There are silences. So it's also, again, what is being said, but also what is not being said, right? And why certain things go unsaid or maybe are said in certain ways. And this is where body language and stuff comes into play. Again, as I've said, these practices are old as time. Unfortunately, they got written out when history became a discipline in the early 19th century. As historians said, we need to be scientists and have a scientific method for what we do, which now means that, because we're enlightened like everybody else, right? And so that means that now the written word is standard. That's it, written word. Then oral histories go away from the discipline, but that doesn't mean they go away. They have a history before that and history after that, and that continues today. So this is often where family, community stories get passed down. And you hear about Grandpa so-and-so doing something years later. Or, you hear about these same stories of people in your community the same time they did this. They had a rally or a party or something. And those get passed down, and that's still history. I'll talk a little bit more about how an oral history is also a conversation when we get later on into the presentation. But as a historian, I got to give you the quick history of how this thing did develop. As I just said, it's been happening pre-history, the ancestors. People have been doing this. Anybody in here seen Black Panther? You can either raise your real hand or your Zoom hand. I love Black Panther. There are many reasons I love Black Panther, okay? Don't judge me tonight. Maybe the cast was extremely attractive, but also a lovely story. Very, very lovely story. And oral histories are part of that, right? This entire film is about this passing down of this idea and this lineage of being part of a kingdom of Black Panthers, right? And the son who has tragically lost his father now has to step up, but he knows the stories. And when he takes this potion, it's like he gets into the world that he knows of orally still. And each tribe has their own story, and you can see it in the dress and how they talk to each other. And people do this, and people continue to do this. But again, like I said, it's written out, or it's seen as less reliable way to do history by those in the academy, again, until the 1940s. A time, where lots of shifts are happening in this country, and globally. I get tired of saying that as a historian, but it's true, especially as we live through some of those times, it's true. And Alan Nevin's 1938 book, The Gateway to History, is kind of recognized as the first reclamation of using oral histories within the academy as good, valid, important primary sources. And at Columbia University, he's the one who creates the first modern oral history archives here in the States. Vansina in the 1960s, who was one of the foremost historians of Africa, considered the idea of what it means if we say that the history of Africa begins with the colonization of it by Europeans. Because that's when we have all these written words, right? What does it mean if we go before that? What are we saying? Are we saying that Africa has no history before European contact? Is that what we're saying? This is also in the 1960s, I mind you, context is important. We're in the midst of the Black Freedom Movement. We're in the midst of Vietnam War. We're in the midst of student and activism globally, right? And that's part of this that leads to these sorts of questions. And so, Vansina pushes that, countering this idea that cultures without text do not have history. Cultures that pass down their history orally or through art or other ways still have history. And then it's important for us to study and elevate those histories. I'll go down to a couple of important Chicagoans. I'm in Chicago base. Studs Terkel, whose Pulitzer Prize winning book of 1984, The Good War, is an oral history of World War II. Fascinating, right? Because he talks to everybody. He talks to people both famous in the war and relatively unknown. People who were overseas were part of it, people who are here in the US. And so that's a rich archive, right? And that's a rich selection of experiences. It's not just soldiers in the war, although that's important. It's not just generals in the war. It's not just, and incredibly important, people who were victimized in the war. We're also talking about the ways that everyday citizens were involved and thought about World War II as well, which leads this to being, a Pulitzer Prize winning book in the 1980s. The history makers are so cool. Founded in 1999 to address the lack of documentation and preservation of the African American historical record. I think they've done over 2,000 to 3,000 oral history interviews. You can go to their website and see nearly a century of African American achievements had gone undocumented. And they said the founder's dream was to address the problem by capturing one person's story one at a time. And this priceless video collection, right? People whose stories and tell us about the changes and important events of African American history in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. Many of these stories had previously been unknown and untold. And so it takes for one person, I love the history makers. These are the stories of the people who make history, because that's the truth of it. We're all historical actors. And so capturing somebody who was not ever going to be a senator or a president's experiences is still just as important. Yes, Timuel Black, who is, and just passed away, unfortunately, last year. I had a student do a research project in my Black Activists in Chicago class, and he did it on Timuel Black, and it was lovely, a really, really lovely experience to watch him tell me that information. So I'll end this part with talking about an article that really stayed with me. It's called Rhonda Y. Williams says, I am a keeper of information, history telling, and voice. So how did I get here? This is a really good question. It's not something that I had planned. I decided, I loved history for a really, 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 really long time. Probably I can remember, probably second, third grade, fourth grade, really just that was my favorite subject. And it stayed with me, through middle school, through high school. I became a history major and African American studies minor in college because I just loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. And a mentor and a teacher at the time who has since turned into my dissertation co-chair turned continuous mentor, Eric McDuffie, who was at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, pulled me aside as a 19-year-old and said, "So are you thinking about grad school next?" And I was like, "What's that?" And he was like, I was like, I come from a Haitian family. All I know is how to be a doctor or a lawyer, girl. I don't do blood. So I think I'm going to do a lawyer track. Johnny Cochran was cool. And he was like, you could do history for a living. And I was like, what? And he was like, you could be a teacher too. And I was like, never. And so I was like, okay, well, that sounds excellent. So I did a summer research program. I got in, I had a blast. And then after I graduated in 2008, I said the PhD is next for me. So I started in 2010 back at the University of Illinois. Wow, grad school was rough. I felt smart all my life except for grad school. And then I was like, I know nothing. And that was the best challenge for me. And one of those challenges came in the form of needing an original dissertation topic. How am I supposed to do that? What does that even mean? And so I had been drawn to stories at that time of Black women activists in the Black freedom movement. So folks like Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, those were people that drew me into wanting to do research. And so I found an archive in Chicago of a Black woman who was an activist. I was ready to go. I had my written words, you see. I was ready to go. I had my archive. I was ready. And then I had coffee with a new professor on campus, and I told him what I wanted to do, and this in 2013. He said, "Oh, that sounds great. I just read that dissertation by somebody at like Northwestern." And I was like, I didn't mute myself. That was the silence that actually happened when he told me that. And after, I cried and such, and, was like, what am I going to do? My partner at the time said, "You legit talk about being Haitian all the time. It's like one of the first things you tell people." See, I'd already told you all, and what are we, 29 minutes? I already told y'all. So he said this to me, and he was like, "Have you ever considered doing research on Haiti?" I was like, "Yeah, well, all right, maybe." So I went to, this is now 2013. I type into, Google Haitians, and in particular Haitians in Chicago, because I knew as a young person that I had grown up in a Haitian community in Chicago. My parents were very active in that community. I spent a lot of my time in that community. So I was like, I wonder what's written about that. I'm sorry. One sociological study from the late 1980s. And so I said, what? This can't be real. Like, people have to have written about this. Come to find out, they hadn't. And what seemed even more preposterous to me about it was that Chicago's origin story begins with a man of Haitian descent, Jean-Baptiste Pointe-du-Sable, and his indigenous wife, Kitty Hawa. So how are there no books besides one that's a smaller study on Evanston written about this? It set me on my journey. And what the journey then did was, oh, I see. I'm sorry. I'm going to stop right here. There's a question. I'm not sure if I missed a question. Christine, is your hand up for that? Or was it that you said you had seen Black Panther? I just want to make sure I didn't miss a question. I will leave questions for the end, and please be sure to pop questions in the chat at any point. So I go back to the story. So I decided to pursue that project, and quickly learned that there was no archive. As a matter of fact, when I pitched the idea to my dissertation committee, no need to apologize, Christine, that happens all the time. So I told my dissertation committee, here's the research that I want to do. And they were like, good luck with that, girl. That sounds great. Like, I mean, it sounds very cool, but like, I don't know who or where you're going to find information on this. And so I said, all right, I know I'm going to find information on this. And so I decided to make one. I went to my dad's beat up old phone book that he had been, probably had since, and, probably had only replaced a couple of times since the late 70s. And started asking about all those people that I remember from my childhood. Would they talk to me? Will they talk to me? Will they talk to me? He was like, yes, I'm sure I'll make them, girl. Okay, so my father and I spent what was then the summer of 2016. He was fine calling his friends, telling them what I was doing. I was drafting up consent forms for the first time because I realized and learned that there's ethics to this. You can't just rip stories from people, so I'm doing all of this. And by the time I finished my PhD, I had done about 40 oral history interviews that became the meat of the dissertation, while I pulled from newspapers and random archives around the city of Chicago to try to make a story. I graduated in 2017. I got a job, thank God, right away at Lake Forest College, where I am now. And they had a grant when I started and said, we know you just started, but this grant sounds very much like it goes with what you're doing. It's a thing called Digital Chicago. We're funding projects that capture unknown histories of Chicago. And I was like, that sounds familiar. And so then I went into and did that. And that was a research that I focused on, a digital project that is now housed with the Chicago History Museum online, that is about Haitian churches in Chicago. So we're the first, my students and I are the first to map and really cover Haitian churches as one kind of part of the community from that summer. And we did oral histories as part of that as well. So I got to work and train students to do that and transcribe them and, do all the things that you need to do. Continue to do these things with my students and think about ways of making the oral histories accessible both inside and outside the classroom. And the latest news is that I am presenting for the first time at the Oral Historian Association's conference, a symposium in June, about the work that the Haitian American Museum and I have been doing. So I'm writing that paper at some time before June. Who knows? That picture, though, who is this picture that I have on the slide? Who is this person? That is my dear colleague, friend, and a real inspiration to me, Elsie Hernandez, the founder of the Haitian American Museum. And I met Elsie by chance. It was 2014 or 2015 at that point. No, I think it was the summer of 2016 that I was starting to do the archival or oral history research. Found out there was a Haitian American Museum, realized I had never heard of it and was like, shame on me. Showed up to the museum with my niece and did a kind of unfiltered, unrecorded oral history interview with Elsie. And I was floored by the work that she was doing and first felt like, wow, this is the sort of work that really I'm just vibing with. Like, how do we build and commemorate, and as Carlos said earlier, change the narrative about Haiti. I see in the chat that Haiti has a very powerful history. It does. But as my father likes to tell me all the time, Haiti will always pay for 1804. Haiti will always pay for being the first Black country to liberate itself from chattel slavery. And I wish he was wrong, but the older that I get and when I continue to see things, even like, this last year at the border and the way that Haitian people and bodies are being treated during a pandemic, women, children, those images say something to me. And they seem very familiar to me as a historian. And so, to see Elsie Hernandez doing that work and getting property in Uptown and doing that has been, again, a joy to witness and be part of. And so we stayed in touch. And this picture from before is actually when Elsie did this amazingly and hilarious thing to me, is that I was honored as the first Haitian American researcher of Chicago. So the sweetest and funnest things you can see on my face. I'm like, me? And yes. And so we continued that. And when I, then more so got into stuff with Lake Forest, et cetera, I saw and realized I had these oral histories. And I was like, okay. I had 2 to 3 friends. I believe one of them is on the call, named Herika Telus, Dr. Telus, who was doing similar research as me, another young Haitian American woman in Chicago doing research on the community. Where's the research? I was like, I don't know, girl, I'm trying some. A few years later, another Haitian American at the University of Illinois reaches out to me and says, I hear what you're doing. Where's the research? I don't know. So I said, well, it seems like I'm going to have to probably do something with these oral histories. And what better place to do them with the Haitian American Museum? And so you see a earlier screen grab of the digital archive that I don't know how Carlos, Ben, Elsie, now, like, I really still don't even know all of the papers that we sent out and had to get things back. And, it has been a labor of love. And we continue to work on this. We hope to grow it. We're in the phases now where we're getting some funding again from Lake Forest in a different grant, the Humanities 2020 grant, to hopefully get photographs so that, they seem more inviting, and we hopefully will get more people to share their stories with the museum. And hopefully the dream is, that I can train young people who will be oral historians for people to come to the museum and they can, start to collect them there. But since 2015, I have done about 60 oral history interviews, and the museum has about 30 of them. So we went through that. It's very exciting. Every time I see my name on that website, I'm like, me, girl? Yes. So how do you do this? Please take some tips from me, because there's interviews where, like, I got half of it. Interviews where you can hear me running around in the background trying to plug things in. The first interview I did, I was in my car on a lunch break, and I didn't record it. I just wrote things down. And sometimes the audio is not good. Test your equipment, please. Not once, but twice. And what equipment am I talking about? Recording equipment. I record my oral histories on this thing right here. This is an iPad. Thank you, Stephen Jobs. Thank you, Stephen Jobs. There's something much more accessible in our technological era where we can do this. We can do this without needing all this fancy equipment. So what recording app? I use Voice Recorder. Or I have another one that I actually use that is called Voice Recorder. Looks like this. It'll pull up. I'll show it to you. You can search in the App Store. It's a free app. And I save them. My mom's constantly backing them up. But test your equipment. Also, never leave home without a notebook and a piece of pencil. Because if everything goes wrong, you at least can take notes from the interview itself. I briefly mentioned that ethics are important. I'm going to stop here to say that they are extremely important. Again, I take you back to the original part of this discussion. There are peoples whose stories have been written out or have been tampered with or silenced, etc., etc. And even when I was doing some of this research, I know my community and I'm a member of my community, right? And I often had to let them know that so that they knew that I was safe to tell their story to. Because folks go into communities all the time. I'm talking to my own fellow academics here. They go into people's communities. They take stories, information, archival material, and they write award-winning books about it. The people in the community ever read that? Do the people in the community have any idea on what it turned into? Oftentimes not, and that's exploitation. And so I am very particular about the consent form that I go through. I send it ahead of time. And I learned to do this through the Illinois Review Board, IRB. It seems like an awful thing to do, but it's one of the best things. So it's a lot of paperwork, but you want people to know that it's not, again, something that you're tampering with. You're not playing with their stories, because people have told me all sorts of things. stories about family separation, stories about family loss, stories about having to escape one's country because they were involved in some activities that were dangerous, but we're doing it to survive. And who am I to now then put that information just out there publicly? We're talking about immigration statuses, people's trauma around child loss, all sorts of things. And so I make sure that they have it ahead of time, and then I talk about it again and hit the major points with them. You can stop me at any time during this interview. If you're not comfortable, you can say next question. Do you want to be anonymous? Guess what? I'm still going to put anonymous, like I'm still going to write about you anonymously. But if you tell me anonymous or not, that's still up to you. Do you want this recorded? Do you not want this recorded? And now the latest thing I ask, I'm working on a project with the Haitian American Museum. We're building this archive. Would you add your story to it? Would you be okay with it being public? And so folks know that they're driving the boat. They're driving this ship. This is their story. I have some questions, but this has taught me how to be the most active listener. It's probably made me better in relationships and as a teacher. I like to talk. I've been talking already for a few minutes, what's been going on. But, I like to talk. I'm loquacious. But that's not a conversation, right? And so I realize much more how to be an active listener, which is engaged. Or paying attention to the speed of the conversation. Sometimes you'll hear in the oral histories that I give an example of my own life as a way for people to be like, oh yes, or get some opening to only talking about themselves. But it's not a whole story about me. It's just like, oh yes, having Haitian parents growing up, an American child can be very strict. I had a lie I used to tell kids all the time when I couldn't go to sleepovers. It was that I was going to see Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Why was that the lie, girl? I don't know. But that usually gets the person to kind of laugh. It's a true story. They understand. And then they usually can say, yes, this is similar. I had to do this. I had to do this. So we're talking to each other and we're talking about our stories and our lives and things that everybody kind of experience, or not everybody, but maybe more particular folks experience. And I'm recording it. And practice has made perfect, or again, at least more comfortable, at least better at it. I still get the butterflies every time I'm about to do one, because every interview is different. I've done an interview that lasted 15 minutes. I've done an interviews that lasted 90. I've done interviews where one of my favorite interviews is it was with an older Haitian man who had been a longtime friend of my dad. He was in his retirement home with his wife. And, she was like in the background doing things on her own. And I was doing the interview with him. And he gets to a point where he says, talking to me about, I ask a question about like, what do Haitians do for fun? I should also talk about my questions. I'll get to that. What's something that Haitians, did for fun in Chicago? And he started talking about Haitian parties and stuff. And then he said there was this club that they used to go to on the South Side called the Caribbean Village, and that it was lit. And one time Shaka Khan came there, and I was like, what? And then in the background, I hear in just a quiet voice, that's also where they used to take their girlfriends. And I was like, oh, ma'am. Oh, okay. Well, would you like to join the interview? Sounds like you have some information as well that you would like to share. Would you? So she sat down and she did the second half of the interview with us. And it was like a much fuller conversation, right? And then the interview was both two oral histories, but like the dynamic of a husband-wife together, and kind of reminiscing about their immigrant story and their marriage and how they acclimated in the hard times and the good times, all of that. She recently passed away, I just found out. And her husband is not doing well either. And so to know that I have that and that I was able to do that with them, there have been about 5 or 6 folks who have passed away that I've done interviews with. And I've had the opportunity to share it back with their families, oftentimes. And it captures them. It captures their story, at least again in the way that they remember it and they wanted to remember it at that time. And I think that's really an extremely powerful thing. Yeah, they'll live on forever. I do ask the same questions. I ask the same about 10 questions, again, because my research is focused on Haitians in Chicago. And so I have a set of about 10 questions that I ask every participant, except when I started doing interviews with Haitian Americans, so the kids, people like me who were born in Chicagoland area in the US to Haitian parents. And I realized I couldn't ask them the third question, which was, why'd you move to Chicago? Because they were like, I don't know, girl. So then I realized from there, I tweaked it. And so there's some questions that are different within those interviews. And so it depends on who I'm talking to. The questions that we did for the Digital Chicago Religion Project, those had a little bit of some different questions as well, since I was interested in religion and church and identity for Haitian people. And so those changed a little bit. So I try to standardize them. I record them. Then thank goodness for transcription software now. So I uploaded into a thing that is called Sonics. It spits out a usually imperfect transcript, and then I have the opportunity to pay and incentivize young students on my campus right now who can do that work of editing transcripts and learning how to do oral histories and the process of it. And I probably worked with about 5 or 6 students since then, and in my time here, and they've all been changed by the projects, and it's been a lovely experience to now then teach them how to do this stuff. Since it says 6:50, I'm not going to do the practice interview, but I can tell you again some of the tips and tricks more if you want to talk about them in Q&A, because I do want to leave time for questions. Thank you so much again to the Illinois Humanities for having me this evening, to the Haitian American Museum. Again, it is just a pleasure of a lifetime to continue to collaborate with you all. I'm just very proud to be part of what is going to be, like the premier Haitian Museum of the Midwest. Okay, like we're already staking our claim. I want to thank my college for especially the grant and the student support. They mean the world to this. The Haitian community in Chicago, again, if any are here or not here, thank you for sharing your stories with me. And I hope that the book, which I should mention, I did sign a contract last month. It will be published by the University of Texas Press, hopefully in 2023. And their stories are in that book. And so I just always want them to be thankful and, know that I'm very thankful for that. And the ancestors, because I feel like this is all for them. And I hope that I'm, reclaiming the ways of our history and the ways of telling our history through this medium. Well, thank you so much. I'll take a pause and see if folks have questions. I appreciate that. And I don't want to say Jatwan. Am I saying that correctly? No, Jatwan. No, I don't want to keep saying it wrong, but thank you so much. It's a beautiful name. I'm sorry that I'm not saying it correctly. And this is why I always tell my students, tell me how to say it so I can say it once. So, I appreciate that. And, Haitian people are Black people. And so that is also why I teach Black history more largely, and encourage my students to do that. Batan, Jatan. Okay, I like that. That's pretty. What surprised you most in your interviews? How much people were willing to tell me. Like, I realized something about people and humans, like, kind of like to talk about themselves if you get them going, most people. And this is a story, they're talking about themselves. And so there was a man, an older man, who told me, he started telling me his oral history and like getting into Haiti, leaving Haiti. He was like, yeah. So then it was a woman that I fell in love with when she was there. And her father really hated me. And so, I thought about, like doing something bad to myself. And I was just sitting there like on the thing, like, oh, oh my gosh, like, thank you for, I didn't know this was going to come out. And then he was like, but then, my heart was mended by the time I got to Chicago. I married the love of my life. And then there was this one time I was at my girlfriend's house and I was like, so there was a girlfriend in or what? Okay. All right. Thank you. So I'm always surprised at, again, sometimes the honesty, and the detail. And then for other folks, it was, kind of very basic answers, and that's okay too. And that says something about the experience. So just how much and sometimes how little people are willing to tell. How was I changed? It's an intimate experience to share in somebody's history and retelling of their life with you. And so to experience those has always been an exchange, and it's always made me reflect even on different moments in my life. And so it's just humbling, like people go through things. I guess I should say that. And sometimes we don't think about the day-to-day in human beings' lives and the things that they carry with them. We can be very hateful sometimes to people. And so then to hear some of the things that people had survived and gone through, it was like, whoa, I wouldn't have known these things. And so it's made me, I think, a little bit more, again, a better listener, as I said earlier, but also more aware of the ways that people move through life and how life changes them. Some thoughts on pairing interviewees and interviewers. Can having shared background knowledge make for a different interview? Absolutely. I'll give you a perfect example of that. So there's an archive, one of the most famous oral history archives is the Works Progress Administration interview, enslaved narratives, ex-enslaved narratives. In the late 1930s, the United States government said, there are some people who are still alive who were enslaved. We should probably get their stories. And so a little over 2,000 interviews were done with people who at that time, were about 65 to 36. Yeah. So about 60, 70 years out from the Civil War. So a lot of the people who were still alive were older and had probably been children in chattel slavery. And the majority of the interviewers were white folks from the South. And so when I tell my students about, and I challenge them, I'm like, you're going to do a research paper on this. And they're like, okay, yeah, in my early African-American history class. And we get into the archives and then they come to me and they're like, Dr. J, there was the enslaved person said that it wasn't that bad. And this goes against everything you've taught me in class. I mean, I've watched 3 episodes of Roots at this point. There's no way it wasn't that bad. And I'm like, yes. Why do you think they said that? Who were they talking to? So we get into that and they're like, oh, it's the Jim Crow South, which means it is extremely volatile racial times. Segregation and racial violence is rampant. And now a nice white person has knocked on your door and said, hi, can you tell me about slavery? It's fine, girl. It's not that, like, are you going to tell? Who are you going to tell? Like this story to, you're with the government, the same government that was like enslaving us. I don't know, girl. This seems, but there were some African-American interviewers and those are a little bit different. You can tell they're different. And so sometimes those commonalities do let people feel more comfortable, but sometimes that can also lead to issues of anonymity. So sometimes people don't feel comfortable with it, somebody that they know, because they feel like maybe that story could still get out. So it's, there should hopefully be a rhythm between them or some sort of connection that can be established. And that's why I think it's important to touch base with the person you're interviewing beforehand. Have maybe a 10-minute conversation with them. Maybe that's when you first go over the consent form with them. And you kind of like see, can you talk to them or they feel comfortable with you before you hit the record or the play on the record button. What are some common mistakes that folks make when conducting interviews? Not hitting record. I'm telling you, you would be surprised how many times that has happened. You're all ready to go and then you're like, or, you know, like the sound is off. So like kind of like knowing your space as well. Where are you? Like what kind of room is it? Is it noisy? Is it not? Talking too much or not talking enough. So kind of accepting one word or kind of like simple answers. So, you know, if a person tells you, hey, you know, this is why I moved to Chicago. And they don't say, oh, you know, what about this? Or, you know, like, can you say a little bit more? So kind of accepting sometimes short answers. I always supplement my oral histories with additional research. So I use newspaper evidence. I use other archival documents if and when they do exist, you know, from different areas. And so I found lovely information about people in Chicago who visited Haiti a lot, including the founder of the Chicago Defender, Robert Abbott, and his nephew, Sangstecki, John Sangstecki, who Sangastak, I'm sorry, who continued the newspaper, and they corresponded and had people in Haiti at that time, which opened up a new archive for me at the DuSable Museum of African American History on a Haitian man who had lived in Chicago for 50 years of his life. A friend of, you know, W.B. Du Bois and Harold Washington, like had no idea this person existed. His archive had been untouched. It had been unopened. We were opening things in it when we found it. And so the additional research sometimes leads to other archival finds as well. And so I use oral histories as one base of a larger history. Did it add to your worldview and create intentionalities in the way I move? I hope yes. You know, I'm scared for my children. They're going to be little, you know, like radical historians who are giving their teachers hell, I imagine. I'm going to have my cell phone on me at that point when I teach, because let the history lesson go wrong. It's going to be, my mama said, and so I'm, you know, very concerned. That's funny, but not too much. But yeah, I really hope that they continue this and other students around me continue to do this. Do you share recording oral history with participants? I do if they ask, absolutely, and offer that to them. And do I conduct oral histories in Creole? There are Creole parts. And so because I'm fluent in Haitian Creole, or not as good as I used to be, but grew up speaking it, there are parts in the interview where especially older folks will catch. They'll switch. I'm saying that's easier for them. And my parents do this. They go between Haitian Creole and English, and I don't stop them. I'm like, oh yeah, I know what that means. I'll get to that later. And I can like transcribe that or include that in the oral history, the English translation. But I think that's important too. I think that's it. I think I did it. Okay, and it's 7. I'm trying to be good on time.
I was about to say, you sure did do it, and it is 7 o'clock. That is perfect. So as we wrap up today, I just do want to thank everyone again for joining us this evening. It has been a pleasure to have you all here, and I really truly hope that you all learned a lot about the power and importance of oral histories. Dr. Joseph, thank you so much for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. And thank you to Illinois Humanities for hosting us tonight. Very quickly, there are 2 ways right now to listen to some of Dr. Courtney Joseph's oral history collection at Hammock. And that first one, as you saw in that screen grab, you can head over to the museum's website, which is www.hammock.org, and click on Oral Histories, which is right on our homepage. And you can listen to some of these amazing stories at ease at your own house. We do have transcripts available upon request. And I do just want to give a huge shout out to Dr. Joseph and her students for taking hours upon hours upon hours to do that transcription work. It is very hard work. So we're very grateful for all of them working on that. And then secondly, thanks to a grant from Illinois Humanities that we got in 2021, Hammock was actually able to create and purchase a touchscreen oral history platform, which is currently on view and available at the museum. It has 5 different topics and themes and 25 snippets from different oral history participants. And one of the newest one is by Shea Raoul, who is actually the son of the current Attorney General, Kwame Raoul. So make sure to come and check it out at the museum the next time you visit. It really is an amazing addition to our space. And then lastly, in the chat box, we will be putting some information about the next Big Read event, which will be happening on Saturday, April 2nd. And then make sure to just stay connected with the museum through our social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, to hear about our upcoming events and to stay involved with the museum. On behalf of Illinois Humanities and everyone at the Haitian American Museum of Chicago, again, thank you so much, Dr. Joseph, for being here tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the weather if you're here in Chicago. Have a good evening, and we hope to see you at another program here in the near future. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.